All right. So I have the pleasure of introducing our speaker today, Professor Antje Kley. Thanks so much for being here and sharing your newest project with us. Professor Kley is the chair of American Studies, in particular literary studies, at the University of Erlangen-Nürnberg. She obtained her doctorate at the University of Mannheim and her habilitation at the University of Kiel. She has also been a visiting scholar at Dartmouth College and fellow of the Princeton University Library. Her list of publications is quite extensive, so let me just highlight a few examples. Professor Kley has published a comprehensive study on the ethics of medial representation in British and US American novels from 1741 to 2000. She has also edited a number of volumes, among them Rural America, together with Heike Paul, and What Literature Knows, together with Kai Merten. Topics she has most recently written about include US print culture, literary narrative, and slow reading in the age of big data, public humanities and literary knowledge, as well as bioobjects and scientific knowledge production in contemporary science novels. Today, she's here to present her current project on narratives of the end of life. Her presentation is titled The End of Vulnerability, the Technological Deferral of Death in DeLillo's novel 0K. So Professor Kley, thank you again so much for being here this evening, and the floor is all yours.
Thank you so much for your kind introduction, and thank you, Klaus, for your invitation. And I want to thank you all for being here at the very end of the semester. I very much appreciate it. And I'm happy to be here. And I'll start right away by sharing my screen. Can you all see that? Okay, and you can hear me okay too. All right. So, with my reading of Don DeLillo's novel 0K, I want to present to you today part of the work on my new book project entitled Death Becomes Us, Narratives of the End of Life. This project connects my long-standing interest in the cultural work of literary, in particular narrative aesthetics, literary knowledge production, and the business of literature on the one hand, with, on the other hand, an attempt of working through my own experience of bereavement via the critical reading of literature. Before I start with an outline of the project's main ideas, let me tell you a little bit about the project's genesis. The project's development was in part prompted and accompanied by the prolonged illnesses and the deaths of both my parents in 2018 and my husband early in 2019. The years of confronting mortality have left traces in my life and work I am struggling to account for partly through my work on this project. When I began reaching for books concerned with experiences of dying and of witnessing someone else's decline of life, I intuitively kept my distance from the self-help department. I didn't want to hear the controlled voice that would console me by explaining the 5 steps of grief to me. Not surprisingly, I guess, I took refuge in both autobiographical and more explicitly fictional reading. Reading literary articulations of the pain connected with the experience of death was what I only later came to call a form of critical solace. And critical solace is a term by David James that I find quite helpful here. So in those precious moments, I managed to concentrate on reading during the years I was enveloped in mortality. Work by Joan Didion, George Saunders, and Paul Kalanithi, among others, offered critical solace by extending a welcome invitation to attend to my own predicament while at the same time assuming a friendly, vicarious distance. Their fiction didn't tell me what to think, feel, or do, but their unsentimental and variously tender or blunt verbal soundscapes counteracted the stories of loss they meticulously recorded and thus supported my efforts at articulating the contradictions of life, after all, in the face of death. They offered a kind of discrepant consolation and sustenance that was impossible to get anywhere else, even though my husband and I were well taken care of by all current standards. Don't worry, it's a privilege and a relief to be able to present and discuss with you my thoughts on death within the conventions of a scholarly paper. The format ensures the safety margin, so to speak, to the topic, and it allows for a scholarly approach without denying the fact that our topics affect us personally in some way or other, no matter how uninvolved we seek to design our observer positions. In contradistinction to the pursuit of alleged neutrality, I've come to believe that a standpoint epistemological clarification of the personal and scholarly interests and preconditions that inform our projects is pertinent for good scholarly practice. So, after these preliminary remarks and by way of introduction, let me frame my reading of Don DeLillo's 2016 novel Zero K that will be at the center of my talk today within this larger project. I will then present my reading of the novel as a defense of the uncontrollability not only of death, but of life itself in sections 2 and 3 of my talk, followed by a brief conclusion. While reaching across the disciplines, Death Becomes Us, Narratives of the End of Life is concerned with recent literary articulations of the process of dying itself, of the ghostly presence of loss and absence, and of the experience of being left behind or surviving. I'm interested in both fictional and autobiographical texts which, and this is a strong selection criterion, which refrain from or reflect critically upon the pervasive discourse that conceptualizes disease along the lines of, I will beat this thing, as an enemy that needs to be fought. My readings, sorry, this is jumbled up, but I guess it's okay. My readings seek to articulate how texts by Susan Gubar, Eve Ensler, Paul Kalanithi, Audre Lorde, Joan Didion, Gail Griffin, Naja Marie Ait, Gish Jen, Julia Alvarez, Alison Bechdel, Celeste Ning, George Saunders, and others socially embed the radically uncontrollable experience of dying and losing a loved one, and how, in particular, they talk about these experiences' wider social conditions and ramifications. How are experiences of loss conditioned by social, cultural, and economic geographies, and how are they institutionally framed? What kind of feelings, thoughts, and actions do they trigger? How does naming these reactions implicate the reader? What are the resources for new conceptions of the self, of others, and of the social and natural environment for those confronting mortality and for those reading about those confrontations? What are the isolating effects and the unexpected relational impulses the experience of dying and reading about it may propel? The texts I read, and these slides are just examples of books that I'm considering, test vocabularies for the articulation of an unsettling, traumatic, and contradictory experience. They try out intricate verbal levers of representing pain in an attempt to begin to make the presumably unrepresentable effectively and cognitively intelligible, lay it bare, question, frame, or transform it. These representations suggest direly necessary leads for expanding and deferring unexamined notions of normal life and for reconceptualizing fundamentally relational mortal lives in contemporary, modern, high-performance societies. With readings of fictional and autobiographical accounts of the experience of death that was too early, dying, bereavement, and grief, the project seeks to supplement discourses in the field of medicine, healthcare, legislation, insurance, and self-help that have been the dominant pathways to talk about death in Western societies in the last 3 to 4 decades. I argue that literary forms of knowledge production around mortality and death meet an acute social need in highly competitive capitalist performance societies to negotiate human vulnerability. I'll come back to the issue of vulnerability in the context of my following brief outline of the 2 lines of argument that the project pursues. I'll begin with the first line of argument. Recent research in medical sociology and medical ethics by Sharon Kaufman, Sonja Mikic, and Giovanni Maio has systematically explored the weaknesses of late capitalist societies' high-tech medical systems. They're geared towards the control of disease and cost at the expense of a clear-eyed and emotionally supportive view of life's end. From this research, the medical hospital emerges as a social space that is ill-equipped for the negotiation of the personally and culturally contradictory process of dying that, in late capitalist consumer societies and since the 1980s, predominantly takes place in its confines. The hospital has become the primary place and institution where, in high-tech capitalist cultures, spatially and psychologically repressed encounters with mortality return with a vengeance in all their personal and cultural ambivalences. The journalist Barbara Ehrenreich speaks of the medicalization of dying and a medical quest for control of human bodies. The neurosurgeon and cancer patient Paul Kalanithi frames death in 21st century capitalist societies in his internationally best-selling autopathography, When Breath Becomes Air, as follows, and I quote, "The questions intersecting life, death, and meaning, questions that all people face at some point, usually arise in a medical context," unquote. And Kalanithi adds that the encounter and address of these questions is at least as much a philosophical as a biological exercise. The medical system is hardly prepared to support its patients' philosophical needs for meaning making along with their physical ones. Only on the fringes of the medical system, in medical ethics and the newly developed branch of palliative care, does a more humble but strongly supportive take on the human body and its needs take hold. My project argues that literature, or the arts more generally, are one public arena in which this philosophical work of meaning making at the intersection of life and death may take place. The project assumes that specifically literary knowledge production may serve to tap and question, undermine, connect, and/or strengthen disciplinary bodies of knowledge, and to attend to questions which medicine and the hospital and healthcare systems raise, but cannot address themselves. As I've elaborated elsewhere, literary knowledge production embeds bodies of knowledge from other disciplines in culturally situated and intersubjective experiential or cognitive contexts. With this function, I conceive of literary writing as a productive approach of the fundamentally uncertain and unsettling landscape of dying and bereavement, which have generated a strong cultural need to negotiate human subjectivity in terms of socially inscribed embodiment, relationality, and vulnerability. By vulnerability, I do not primarily mean a weakness that calls for protection. With such diverse critics as the feminist philosopher Elizabeth Grosz, the psychologist Kenneth Gergen, Judith Butler, the African-American studies critic Joseph Winters, and the social philosopher Martin Schnell, I conceive of vulnerability as a general condition which precedes vulnerabilities that are opposed to health. In this account, vulnerability designates, as Butler puts it, the porous and interdependent character of our bodily and social lives, unquote. Winters also fleshes out vulnerability as receptivity to the signs of the past in the present and to the ways they affect us economically, socially, and emotionally. Importantly, this general vulnerability and propensity towards receptivity and relational being doesn't make human beings all the same, because the ways in which we're situated script the implications of those general conditions. Butler therefore reminds us that, and I quote again, a shared condition of social life, of interdependency, exposure, and porosity does not cancel a related sense of vulnerability as the greater likelihood of dying understood as the fatal consequences of a pervasive social inequality. I come to my second line of argument. Together with critics like Thomas Macho and Christine Marek, Corinna Kardoff, and Inga Anderson, my project observes a new cultural visibility of death in late capitalist transatlantic cultural geographies. In addition to new TANA technological commemorative practices and spaces that digitalization has opened up, cultural productions of the past 3 to 4 decades across the media address death, illness, dying, and bereavement. Examples include, and I want to add to the disclaimer here, that the graphic images on the following slide, it's just one slide though, might not be for everyone. They include the anatomist Günther von Hagen's International Body Worlds exhibitions, the British photographer Sue Fox's images from the Manchester mortuary, as well as TV series like 6 Feet Under, Dead Like Me, CSI, and more recently, The Good Place. Comics and graphic novels like those by Alison Bechdel and Tom Hart, games, performances, autobiographies, and novels. This new cultural visibility of death both reacts against and collides with the invisibility. There's a book missing here. Sorry. Oh. Need a second book. Had a second book. Anyway, the invisibility, the social denial and repression of death that the French historian Philippe Ariès, whose book you don't see on the slide, has diagnosed in his 1973 study of Western attitudes toward death. The psychologist Pauline Boss has specified Ariès' arguments for the US. In her empirical work over the past 20 years, she traces the social denial of death in the US as far back as the Vietnam War. She argues that the American nation in particular, a nation which likes to imagine itself in control of its own and other nations' fate, suffers from ambiguous loss, from individually and collectively unresolved grief. Boss attributes US American ambiguous loss to the history of slavery and racism in particular, but also to the Civil War, the history of immigration, and specifically the wars in Korea, Vietnam, and the Middle East, 9/11, and last but not least, the Corona pandemic. She's currently working on the Corona pandemic and ambiguous loss. And she argues that all of these have sent strong and lasting senses of mortification across the country, which always looks to the future and is so highly invested in making, in doing, and in success. Only last week, Aleida Assmann has explained in her keynote at the Bavarian American Academy how the US future outlook troubles the nation's need to account for its common slave past in a national narrative. Recent work in African American studies on non-pathological reconfigurations of melancholy by Jermaine Singleton, Joseph Winter, Stephen Best, and Christina Sharp also addresses unresolved collective grief and the vital need for temporalities which neither cancel the past in favor of a future directed present or make the present equal to the past. How the past may be seen to relate to the present in ways that are both sufficiently acknowledging and generative in directions other than the progress romance, which demands that moving forward requires not looking back, is a central question for individual and collective confrontations with mortality and death. I see important connections between my own work on the literary negotiation of individual encounters with death and work on collective grief, or as Christina Sharp puts it, wake work. In particular, in reference to their exploration of temporalities and their situatedness in one and the same multi-layered larger context. And for example, Julia Alvarez's Afterlife or George Saunders' Lincoln in the Bardo, I think, are two novels which begin to explore these connections between the individual and the collective. My project claims that the new cultural visibility of death and the confrontation between social denial, repression, and ambiguous loss on the one hand, and new medial figurations on the other, indicates an ongoing recalibration of the social significance of death. I see the current recalibration closely tied to biomedical development and its technological promise to understand, order, alter, and control the phenomena of life, to the normalization of longevity among those who have access to the healthcare system, and to the ways in which the AIDS epidemic has given rise to public grief work. This is the project frame that my reading of 0K is embedded in. And I want to start on that reading now. I want to present Don DeLillo's novel as a lucid fictional discussion of the human wish to control death. The novel employs the idea of bringing death under control as an analytic lens to articulate Western late modernity's consumerist fantasies of technological control and its rising fear but weak grasp of its own precarious predicament. 0K projects a near future scenario in which wealthy customers may choose a cryostatic suspension of death in order to profit from future medical advance. The novel's plot unfolds as the 60-year-old billionaire Ross Lockhart plans to be cryopreserved together with his terminally ill second wife, Artis, in a remote and emblematically postmodern compound somewhere in an unspecified desert area within the territory of the former Soviet Union. He asks his estranged son, Jeffrey, the novel's narrator, to join him at the remote necropolis, for which he's also a major investor. As the son prepares to bid an uncomfortable farewell to his father and stepmother, he struggles with the alienating and deformative dimensions of technological optimization. Through his coolly analytical perceptive perspective, the novel presents the attempt to own immortality in ways that are uncannily commensurate with Frederick Jameson's conceptualization of the cultural dominant of the logic of late capitalism. And it also presents it as fundamentally asocial. At the same time, the novel renders the acknowledgement of the radical uncontrollability of death and of pain of loss as necessary to human flourishing. In 0K, wishing to control death and striving to own immortality figure as strategies of devaluing life, strategies of denying the messy, complicated, frequently violent and contradictory context of historically and socially situated, fundamentally interdependent human being by means of a commodified escape. This fantasy of control as escape from life is encapsulated most pointedly in a phrase one of the anonymous authorities at the cryonic compound uses to explain the philosophical heart of the convergence. Convergence being the term that is used by the company to describe the process of cryopreservation. The authority proclaims, and I quote, "To some extent, we are here in this location to design a response to whatever eventual calamity may strike the planet. At some point in the future, death will become unacceptable even as the life of the planet becomes more fragile." Unquote. A science the narrator sees awash in irrepressible fantasy, cryopreservation is hailed here not only as securing future life chances, but as an escape from hunger, climate crash, terrorism, war, epidemics, and violence. Scenarios which in the novel are the spectacular subject of oversized screenings in the bare hallways of the compound, which confront the disoriented visitor seemingly at random. Overcoming death and the fantasy of control associated with it here figures as an escape route from a fear of the uncontrollability not only of death, but of life and of a fundamentally threatening world. The narrator's father, the investor, Ross Lockhart, asserts his complete medical, technological, and philosophical confidence in the compound's interdisciplinary project of cryopreservation and its fantasy of control. Nothing here is speculative, he explains to his son. Nothing is wishful or peripheral. Faith-based technology, that's what it is. Another God, not so different, it turns out, from some of the earlier ones, except that it's real, it's true, it delivers life after death. Return to the earth, emerge from the earth, unquote. The techno-religious belief Ross articulates here seeks to extend the Christian liturgical phrase from ashes to ashes, with its claim that human beings return to the earth or ice and emerge from the earth or ice. Its central article of faith is a double purifying separation from life on a material and on a personal level. The compound structure is separated from the material world and, as the narrative puts it, from the limits of believability and the law. And the individual self is submitted to a process of separation from its worldly embeddings in order to achieve the complete self-sufficiency the compound is emblematic for. As Ross Lockhart explains in reference to the location, and I quote, "This is what we want, this separation. We have what is needed, durable energy sources and strong mechanized systems, blast walls, fortified floors, structural redundancy, fire safety, security patrols, land and air, elaborate cyber defense, and so on," unquote. Ross Lockhart's take on the physical compound and his vision of the so-called convergence are both directed toward complete self-sufficiency. This self-sufficiency practically functions, I claim, as an extension of his own aloof solipsism that he acquired early and cultivated persistently throughout his life. He had, as the narrator found out as an adolescent, invented his name, choosing to shake both the indistinctness and the responsibilities connected to his birth name, and to abandon his generational history, all the lives up to his sons that were folded into the letters of his name. Later, Ross walked out without an explanation on his first wife and their 13-year-old son, Jeff, while Jeff was doing math homework. The narrator describes his father as emotionally completely detached. For example, while trying to find out from his father where the compound is actually located, Jeff understands that he, his father, did not see the person he was talking to. He had the drifter's inclination to be impervious to names and faces. These were interchangeable components, room to room, country to country. He did not talk so much as narrate. He traced a wavy line, his, and there was usually someone willing to be the random body that he told the stories to, unquote. The figure of Ross Lockhart would be a caricature if it weren't for his love for his second wife, Artis, who, as an archaeologist, has cultivated a professional interest in the past throughout her life. Nevertheless, being as accomplished in emotional detachment as he is, the convergence would simply extend Ross's separation from the messy dramas of life, and it would also separate him from the loss of his wife. I'm ending one version of my life to enter another and far more permanent version, he says. He explains to his incredulous son. Like healthy Ross, his terminally ill wife, Artis, believes that after the convergence, she will, quote, reawaken to a new perception of the world. I will be reborn into a deeper and truer reality, unquote. She prepares for her journey into the unknown truth, somewhere outside of time and outside of history, by shedding everything she knows, by separating herself from the artificial shell that she had previously accepted as her identity. She will become, as the narrator puts it, pure self suspended in ice. The compound's anonymous authorities explain the life update they produce on the basis of complete self-sufficiency as follows. We are here to learn the power of solitude. We are here to reconsider everything about life's end. And we will emerge in cyberhuman form into a universe that will speak to us in a very different way. Solitude, yes. Think of being alone and frozen in the crypt, the capsule. Solitude in extremis. Alone. Think of the word itself, Middle English, all one. You cast off the person. The person is the mask, the created character in the medley of dramas that constitute your life. The mask drops away and the person becomes you in its truest meaning, all one. The self. What is the self? Everything you are, without others, without friends or strangers, or lovers or children, or streets to walk, or food to eat, or mirrors in which to see yourself. Unquote. So, according to the compound's rationale, becoming an authentic self in preparation of a life update means leaving the world behind and choosing to buy social death. The uncontrollability of death is kept at bay through the controlled shedding of absolutely every aspect of life. Along with their fear of death, customers shed their history, their social relations, their responsibilities. The narrative contemplates what remains after this shedding in the short interchapter entitled Artis Martineau, which connects the two main parts of the book. It's just a 6-page short chapter. Here, Jeff imagines his father's wife, Artis, a body in a capsule, quote, no, I don't have that, sorry. Living with the grim limits of self drawn so tight that she's trapped forever. Jeff presents the escape from death as a trap that is disconnected, contextless, unmoving self. Paradoxically, the fear of death has been replaced in this vision with the fear of life in a hyperbolic medicalization of life. It is a strong and resonant image for the deadness of a fully engineerable world. Objections to the protocols enacted by the compound and to their underlying convictions occur in the novel in the form of questions that are swept away. Two further authorities, whom the narrator takes to be adventurers rather than scientists or social theorists, and whom he chooses to call the Stenmark twins, list a collection of substantial questions the project of mastering life extension might raise. Skeptics might ask, for example, what will happen to social institutions, to personal energies and aspirations, to the world of art, to history, to money, to God. The Stenmark twins list these questions, however, only to brush them away and to assert what the narrator takes to be their disembodying aesthetics of seclusion and concealment, and I quote. But we reject these questions. They miss the point of our endeavor. We want to stretch the boundaries of what it means to be human, stretch and then surpass. We have remade this wasteland, this secluded desert shithole, in order to separate ourselves from reasonableness, from this burden of what is called responsible thinking, unquote. The Stenmark twins once again articulate the private cryonic project's absolute and explicitly trans-rational commitment to rejecting life as it is in order to avoid death and to wager on an entirely unknown future update of life. In the novel, the compound's advertisement of its services functions as a razor-sharp analytical hyperbole which holds up an uncomfortable mirror to a competitive high-tech capitalist culture obsessed with control, rugged individualism, and the romance of progress, which demands that moving forward means not looking back. The novel, I claim, articulates a different, much more humble wager, a wager for everyday sociability. There's no fundamental alternative promise in this wager, and it is articulated in the same clipped and emotionally detached language as all the passages I have quoted. But the novel's wager rejects the fear of life that replaces the fear of death in the techno-religion the novel presents to its readers. This wager for everyday sociability is built on the interrelation of two elements. The first element is the narrator's presentation of the techno-religious faith in permanent life extension, as a drastic prism of what the German sociologist Hartmut Rosa would call late modern cultures of control. Rosa conceptualizes the basic political, social, and psychological conflict of late modernity as an exacerbated tension between wanting to let life happen or a desire for resonance and the demand to make things and events manageable and bring them under control. And this is a quotation from Rosa's The Uncontrollability of the World. The mode of dynamic stabilization characteristic of modern society structurally imposes the constant expansion of our share of the world and thereby enforces a program of making the world limitlessly controllable, thus codifying an aggressive relationship to the world. But the fact that the world nevertheless continues to elude us, repeatedly proving itself to be uncontrollable in spite of all our efforts, is itself a functional requirement without which social life would long since have become rigid and sclerotic. In consequence, the dynamism of social life is generated precisely by the constantly shifting front lines in the conflict between what is controllable and what is uncontrollable, unquote. I read Don DeLillo's fictional presentation of the compound and its philosophy of convergence that I just presented as a figure or a trope which captures the paradox of control that Rosa articulates in his sociology in a single image. With its hyperbolic scope, the image articulates a drastic critique of the logics of late capitalist social life, in particular of its lack of receptivity for the complex temporality of embodied relational being that the encounter with mortality so drastically reminds us of. The second element in support of the novel's wager for everyday sociability is the narrator's presentation of snippets from his own everyday life, his search for a job and his relationship to his partner, Emma, which is the main concern of the second part of the novel, partly set in New York. The narrator here describes himself as a man who's intimidated by clear instructions, who likes to drift into things, in and out of jobs, from one woman to another. But he currently lives with his partner, Emma, who takes things as they come, and who is with Jeff even when she is not. He talks about Emma's strained relationship to her adopted Ukrainian teenage son, Stak, whose life in an orphanage she had seen as bereft of expectation and had meant to make meaningful. But now, just a brief visit by Stak undermines Emma's self-command. Jeff joins Emma to one of her special education classes on a day for parents to visit the school. While he himself feels alienated there, he enjoys to see her moving with authority and self-assurance among the children. Jeff presents Emma and himself as comfortable with each other. Looking at each other in the mirror, he says they see first person plural, a blended set of images. Emma and him are fluent at enjoying the present as it is. Know the moment, feel the gliding hand, gather all the forgettable fragments, fresh towel on a rack. Nice new bar of soap, clean sheets on their bed, her bed, our blue sheets. This was all I needed to take me day to day, and I tried to think of these days and nights as the hushed countermand, ours, to the widespread belief that the future, everybody's, will be worse than the past. Unquote. The narrative reports, however, that the idea of future years was too broad and open a topic for us to explore. And the past, like the future, is as difficult a topic for Jeff as it is for his father, from whose example he had been trying to get away all his life. Too late does he realize that he should have unfolded his history and vented the ghosts of his past. He needed to talk to Emma, tell her everything finally, father, mother, stepmother, the name change, the numbered levels, all the blood facts that follow him to bed at night. It's too late for now because Emma's son Stak has disappeared and his mother is absorbed in searching for him. Jeff regrets his reluctance to tell Emma about his past. He speaks of his sad, damning failure to tell her who I was, to narrate the histories of his mother Madeline and Ross and Artis, and the still life future of father and stepmother in cryonic suspension. He regrets his reticence in particular, he realizes, because wanting Emma to see him in an isolated setting outside the forces that made him was exactly the asocial attitude he hated so much in his father. His own detachment was terrifyingly coterminous with the techno-religious rejection of life he was so profoundly irritated by. These brief comments of regret underscore the alignment of the cryo compound's techno-religious worship of absolute self-sufficiency with the myth of unencumbered autonomous agency anchored so deeply in American culture. They also give the novel's wager for an everyday sociability, for the importance of the seemingly banal temporality of relational being weight. So let me come to my very brief conclusion. The novel ends with an appropriately vague sense of promise. Emma finally calls Jeff, reporting her son Stack's violent death somewhere in Ukraine. The reader knows that Jeff has seen Stack's death in the footage that is presented at the compound in support of its mission. Emma's search for Stack and her presumed grief for her son's death figure as the return of the messy life that is systematically repressed and shut out of the compound's procedures designed to extend life beyond death. Jeff and Emma talk on the phone, quote, in the manner of near strangers, and then they assure each other that they will talk again. This vague promise is ennobled in the novel's last short chapter, in which Jeff, riding the crosstown bus right after the phone call, witnesses the tide of light of the Manhattan solstice, the full solar disk bleeding into the streets. The novel closes on him being soothed not directly by this image, but by a young boy's pre-linguistic howls of awe at the intimate touch of earth and sun. Jeff, painfully suspended in his relation to Emma and filled with wonder at the boy's pure joy. This is the novel's counter-image to the narrator's 6-page imagination placed between the two parts of the book of his stepmother's isolated body in a pod, suspended in ice. So while projecting a fantasy of bringing death under control, the novel insists on the radical uncontrollability not only of death, but of life itself, and on the life-affirming need to acknowledge the pain of loss. And I thank you for your attention.
Thank you for this very intriguing talk, and I'm looking forward to the end product very much. I'm just wondering, because the examples you pointed out and the novel you discussed in the second part of the talk, would you say there might be any poetic parallels between, let's say, Joan Didion's The Year of Magical Thinking and Zero K? Because I actually just read The Year of Magical Thinking a few weeks ago for the first time, because that's interesting. It was I was told by somebody to read it.
Oh.
Who
now
passed
you're
it.
frozen,
Said, well, she read this when.
Patrick,
can you hear me again?
Yeah, we lost you. Could you repeat your
Am I back?
One? Yeah.
Somebody asked you to read. Yeah, somebody asked you to read Joan Didion.
Yes, and I did, and it was an interesting experience because it was recommended to me for a very specific reason, to deal with my own grief, so to speak. And so would you say there are, because from what I gathered from Zero K, the novel is a very different outlook on the whole topic than, let's say, a text like The Year of Magical Thinking. But are there parallels in that, the way it deals with the topic, or maybe something else? I don't know, but is there a similarity between the two texts, let's say, because they couldn't be, I don't know, more far apart on different scales, but maybe on that scale?
Yeah. I think they're very different texts, Joan Didion's The Year of Magical Thinking and Zero K, but I am going to read them in the same project within the same book. And Didion's book deals with her loss. This is the book that deals with her husband's loss, right? She has a second book where she deals with her daughter's loss, with her husband's loss. And it's very much a very intricate autobiographical observation of her own everyday life after her husband all of a sudden sort of keeled over and is gone. Of course, this is a very, very different novel. It's also poetically very different. But I think what they have in common is the confrontation with mortality. All these novels that I'm reading confront or show their protagonists in confrontation with mortality and confront the reader with mortality in very different ways. And I think that they support a call for this idea of a general vulnerability of life that I introduced somewhere in the first part of my talk. I think that is something that would connect these vastly different books. And I would throw in George Saunders' Lincoln in the Bardo for another very different kind of text, and Paul Kalanithy's autopathographical account of his own transition from a neurosurgeon to a terminal cancer patient. All of these are very different books, tell very different stories, but they all confront mortality either autobiographically or fictionally, either from the perspective of those who are ill and die, or from the perspective of those who are left over all of a sudden. I don't know if that begins to address your question.
It does, but I have a follow-up question, if I may pose it.
Yeah.
Isn't, like, following that line of argumentation, couldn't you also say that maybe all literature could be seen as confrontation to one's own mortality or the mortality of our loved ones? Because in a way that, you know, if you feel inclined to write down something, be it an autobiographical account of your own life or of a loved one, or maybe a novel, the written word always confronts mortality in a way that's very, you know, it doesn't have to do anything with everyday life, but it's maybe in writing itself, this confrontation. So it might be argued that all literature is, you know, the product of, you know, this confrontation in a way.
That's a grand claim, but it's definitely worth thinking about. And maybe that would also be an interesting piece of argument in the general debate about, you know, the functions of literature and what's important about literature anyway. I'll keep that in mind and carry that with me. So far, I've been looking at very direct representations of the confrontation with mortality. Yeah.
Brian, do you mind if I make a comment directly to what you know, this exchange between Patrick and Antje? Okay. Well, first of all, thanks again for this great talk, and actually tons of stuff comes to my mind, and I was trying to process some of them, some of the ideas that I had while you were speaking, and I want to take it in a direction, you know, this intimate connection or relationship that you are arguing for between narration and grief, or narration and vulnerability, or narration and death, depending on how you look at it. And of course, Patrick's comment goes in the same direction. Even though I think it adds a you know, different aspect to it. that is quite an ambiguous one. There are two levels, I think, on which one could talk about these issues. The one is, of course, the level of representation. And what comes to mind is books like Elaine Scarry's The Body in Pain, or Susan Sontag's Illness as Metaphor, both of which argue that there's a certain unrepresentability of pain, or the body in pain, or the grieving person, or whatever you want to look at here. And with Susan Sontag even going beyond that, and arguing that it's actually wrong to actually try to do that, politically wrong, because it does not do a service to the grieving person. So there's this problematic of should we do it at all in the first place, and if we do it, could it be done, and to what extent could it be done? But then there's yet an entirely different level where narration or narrative and death come together. Think of Scheherazade and this idea that as long as you talk, as long as you narrate, as long as you relate a story, you are not going to die. You could, I was thinking while you were talking about DeLillo that you could take DeLillo and his whole life as an enormously prolific narrator and novelist and writer, and his career-long or lifelong obsession with the topic of death, obviously in White Noise, it's all over the place. And critics have written about this obsession with death in DeLillo's work, that he is producing novel after novel, in order to achieve something that, Scheherazade already wanted to achieve, namely to not go under and be unrepresented, in a way. And there's William Gaddis, Agape Agape comes to mind. It's the same story, an old man who knows who has cancer, who knows that he's going to die. The alter ego of Gaddis, the narrator, trying to prolong the novel, to extend the novel so that death is kept, at a distance. So this is the other function of, I think, of narrative here, that purely, regardless of what you narrate, actually, and regardless of what you are able to represent, it empowers the very act of narration itself. And so I think those two novels, those two levels are enormously important for your project. And I wonder how you deal with them, and have you sought out maybe the two already, or are you going rather in one direction and not so much in the other direction? How that works. And of course, I think with all of the literature that you mentioned, when people who had been in a particular situation where they had to confront, these existential issues, and then they write about themselves. So memoirs, self-writing, autobiographical writing, I think is yet another, pool of literature that you have to treat, I guess, differently than a novel such as DeLillo's. So there's, it was just some food for thought here, I guess, in a comment I wanted to make.
Okay. I see three issues that I'd like to address. Let me start with the last one, fiction and autobiography. I've previously been working on autobiography even way back in my dissertation, and I enjoy reading autobiography not so very differently from fiction. And I think of autobiography, of course, it's marketed differently, and it has a different claim in terms of authenticity, also legal authenticity, and has different legal implications. But in terms of reading, I'd like to see that the biography works with sometimes the same kinds of narrative patterns, with the same kinds of poetic, it performs the same kind of poetic work that fiction performs as well. So I tend not to distinguish strictly between fiction and autobiography. I always say autobiographical and more explicitly
Yeah.
fictional writing. That's how I make the distinction.
No, Antje,
clearly that, yeah.
No, just to qualify, what I actually meant was, if you look at the writing self from that perspective, because then it becomes, I think, therapeutical to a certain extent, often, to write about your own grief, to write about your pain, to write about the challenges that you're facing in that sense, not as a literary genre or something,
Yeah, okay, but that, I think that is true for both autobiography and for fiction as well.
Okay.
The therapeutic aspect. Think of Joan Didion. I mean, of course, they are autobiographical. But think of somebody like Julian Barnes. He's a British author.
Yeah.
His writing, for example, very much fictional, but still therapeutic in a sense, in relation to his own life. Let me pick up on the Susan Sontag idea and the claim that it is politically wrong to represent the unrepresentable. My project would go against that radical claim. What I find the important dimension in Susan Sontag's work on illness is her insistence on prying apart representations of death or illness and their moral evaluation. I think that's what she's really critical of, this tying of an illness to an individual responsibility. And the cancer personality, for example. If somebody dies of lung cancer, they must have had a terrible smoker's life, for example. These kinds of shortcuts. I think she takes a very strong stance against that, and I entirely go with her there. But I wouldn't go as far as to say that confrontations of death, mortality, the process of dying, and what it means to experience grief, that these experiences must not be representable or aren't and shouldn't be represented. I wouldn't go that far. I think we do need to attempt to represent them, or need to attempt to represent especially what is widerständig, I'd say in German, what's difficult to represent. And we need to find ways to talk about that or to address that. And I believe that literature is one way of doing that kind of work. And it would be sort of contradictory to me to argue that literature may not do that, or that it's somehow wrong or politically wrong or morally wrong to attempt these kinds of representations.
Thanks.
And then you raised a third issue. As long as you talk or narrate, you're not dead. And it's interesting when you take, for example, Paul Kalanithy's autobiographical account of his dying of, I think it was lung cancer, him being a neurosurgeon, and sort of his fall from the grace of medical authority to becoming a terminal patient. And he wasn't able to finish his autobiography because he died before he finished it. So another voice had to finish it. His wife finished the book and saw it through publication and oversaw the translation into, I think, 40 languages by now, including Hebrew and Tamil. And so it's not like as long as you talk, you're not, well, as long as you talk, you're not dead, but when you're dead, you just don't talk anymore. And it's not like you could just go on talking and you won't die. You will die. It doesn't help to keep talking. And I guess this general argument would be the one that Patrick picked up earlier, that any kind of writing is sort of a confrontation of mortality, which is probably true, but that's sort of the strong generalization that I'm less interested in. Yeah.
Thanks, Antje.
So Brian wanted to ask a question before, and then Manu, I think.
Yes, and hopefully you guys can hear me okay. I thought it was also excellent, and like Patrick, I'm very interested to see the final product. And it's also kind of funny because I just bought 0K yesterday at the used bookstore here, so it's perfect timing. But I was curious about the word confrontation with death, and in particular the word confrontation. I'm curious on what that does, maybe philosophically, compared to writers who kind of accept death or the oncoming of death and then contemplate that, you know, in different ways. I don't know why, but I thought about the book, The Diving Bell and the Butterfly. If you're familiar with the French, whose name I forgot. He was the editor of Elle or Vogue, and he was in a terrible car accident, and he could only communicate by blinking. And he died soon after, and he knew he was going to die, and he wanted to kind of get ideas, thoughts, you know, things down before he died. And so I was curious about the idea of knowing death is near and trying to get it out, as opposed to, in a way, confronting death or challenging death in ways that some of the writers that you talk about do. So that's what I was curious about.
Yeah, thank you very much for that question, because it allows me to clarify something. I prefer actually the term encounter rather than confrontation. I know I said confrontation, I used it a couple of times now, but it's exactly this idea of fighting death and fighting a fatal disease, and we must beat this thing. This is the kind of rhetoric that I'm trying to stay away from, and that's also one of my selection criteria. There are lots of illness narratives that follow this pattern, and Kuzer, for example, argues that that's actually the largest market share are these kinds of narratives where patients in autobiographical accounts relate how they suffered from illness ABC, and they fought it and they survived, and now they emerge successfully as a phoenix from the ashes. Yeah, and that's the kind of narrative pattern that I'm trying to avoid, and I'm simply interested in narratives that do something else, that narrate an encounter of death, and this idea that mortality is a part of life and is not its end, and that dying is a part of life, even though you will be dead at one point and it will be life's end, but the dying process is still a part of life. So I prefer the word encounter to confrontation. And I'm very much interested in ways of getting to know this, or becoming close to, or getting close to what it means to be a mortal being, what it means that we all are mortal beings. And this is what I'm trying to capture with this idea of vulnerability, that that we're all in a fundamental way vulnerable, not autonomous, dependent on each other, volatile beings. Yeah, but your question reminds me that I need to be careful not to sort of, in the way that I speak about my project, that I don't reinstate kind of rhetoric that I'm trying to stay away from. So thank you for that.
Manu, you also had a question.
Yeah, just a quick remark and a question. And the quick remark has to do with an essay by Benjamin, the storyteller. And it's quite interesting because the whole point of that essay is that, so quote unquote, we read for death. Because you know, the reader knows that the characters in the story will either really die or they will die symbolically because the story will end at some point. And so I think it's just an interesting essay on the relationship between you know, narrative and this idea of dying, and it's remarkable that Benjamin addressed that topic. My real question, so to speak, and you started to address this issue in your answers, has to do with form, so to speak, and more specifically. So my question would be, what happens to form? What happens to language when these narratives, be they, you know, autobiographical narratives or novels, what happens to language when they try to explore the unexplorable, so to speak, which is, of course, death? So have you, could you isolate any recurring patterns in terms of, you know, point of view, or even at the level of the, you know, the structure of the novel, so to speak? I think that would be, this is something I'm really interested in. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that question. And looking at the novels that I've read, I think they're very different ways of the language acts in very different ways in these different novels. When I'm taking, for example, Marie Aid's short book, When Death Takes Something From You, Give It Back. She's a Danish poet who lives in New York, and she, in this short book, she accounts for her son's death, accidental death. And here, and in Susan Griffin's Landscapes of Grief, both very new books from 2020 or 2019, what I see there is a very tentative use of language. And I think that's also true for Joan Didion. This very tentative, slow use of language, sort of trying to, you know, feel the way forward in this unknown terrain. And also almost a stuttering and a stumbling. And Marie Aid, she even has this passage where right after the death of her son, she puts everything in quotation marks, or she says she felt like she was talking in the group, in the family, like everything was in quotation marks. Do you need something to eat? Can I get you something? Whatever, all these small gestures as if in quotation marks. So there's this very tentative kind of language that is used. And another strategy I find is a very experimental use of language. And that would, for example, be true for George Saunders' Lincoln in the Bardo, which is very much an experimental novel / drama. And it is both fantastic and weirdly realistic. And so that's another version that we find sometimes, this attempt to go into non-realistic directions. And then when we look at DeLillo, he uses this very perceptive, very sensitively perceptive, but very cool, analytic voice to talk about the encounter of death. So I see very different attempts in these books to approach, I'm trying to be careful with my words now, not to say confront, to approach the experience or the encounter with death. So I can't be any more specific than that, but except to describe sort of different attempts to perform that in language.
Georgia, go ahead.
Yeah, I was interested in the idea of temporality, and you were talking about the idea of controlling mortality, and I have to think about Alison Bechdel's Fun Home, and I'm interested in this idea of temporality because it seems to me that there is, I mean, I don't know too much of Don DeLillo's 0K, but I think I see a pattern in, well, between Bechdel's book and Joan Didion's, but also I think, if I remember correctly, Lincoln in the Bardo, and the idea of rethinking mortality and death through the imagination. And all these books, it seems to me, resist linearity in a way. They reimagine life and death, and they kind of elaborate these issues through juxtaposing present, past, future. I mean, Bechdel's example is really the apotheosis, you know, of this technique, because she does this visually. So I was wondering if in the works of fiction and nonfiction that you've been working with, if there is a pattern there of, you know, playing with temporality, and if this has something to do with the idea of controlling mortality.
I think temporalities are very important in all of these different texts, and you're also correct with your assumption that temporalities are reassembled in non-linear ways somehow in these books, and I think that has to do with the fact that death figures as a disruption, not an interruption, but a disruption, a fundamental disruption in sort of time and space, in the experience of time and space, both for the person dying and for those around the person dying. And reassembling temporalities and the process of sort of reappropriating takes from the past into the present, and for a future that's going to be a future that is very different than what you had thought so far. I think that is fundamental for all of these narratives. And this idea of getting away from what you were having to get away, being forced to go somewhere else, then because you're not able to fall back on the sort of time pattern that was your normal life, that was your everyday expectation, and having to sort of step by step find some other so far untrodden path to go and to reassemble memories and expectations. That requires sort of a reorganization of the entire time-space continuum, if you want. I think that's key in all of these narratives. Yeah. May I ask a question of Patrick?
Sure, go ahead.
Yeah, Patrick, you said that somebody recommended Joan Didion's book to you to address your own grief, and I was wondering whether your experience of reading the book offered something like critical solace to you, or whether you felt that in reading somebody else's encounter and attempt to deal with loss, whether that allowed you some space for your own process of grief.
Well, I have to say that the special book itself didn't really do anything else than other texts might have. I have to say that reading itself has been very vital for me in that regard. I kind of I don't know why, but reading immensely helped, but not necessarily a text that's so specifically about loss. I wouldn't say that was a very different experience to let's say another book, which kind of surprised me, to be honest, because I have sought out books on the topic at the time and stuff like that, and I enjoyed reading them immensely, and I don't know that there wasn't a different there was not something else there for me. I maybe unconsciously, I don't know, not consciously, that would be my answer.
Can I say something? I that's directly to what Patrick said. This idea that reading itself, the activity of reading, that does do the trick rather than the content of what you read. I was also reminded of a poem that I've written about 20 years ago, or maybe even longer than that, by Elizabeth Bishop, "The Art of Losing." That is a very famous poem, and it of course deals directly with the poetress' own grief and loss of her partner, and of a country, and of her house, and all of these things. And what's stunning really is that the poem itself, I mean, the topics of what the poem addresses or what it talks about are not so important here. But I think what's important is rather the form of the villanelle, which is a very old form. It's a kind of litany. It pivots on iteration and repetition, and it's like going to a ceremony, and the priest or someone that retells the story of the person's life that you have lost. And I think in that kind of iteration and repetition, there is something tremendously soothing. And I have to say, when I lost both of my parents when I was relatively young, and I had a hard time coping with that. But once you actually go to there is a ceremony, there is a kind of reenactment of the person's life. I experienced that as on that relatively simple level as a very therapeutic and a great thing, actually, that helped me a lot. And I think in that sense, I would completely subscribe to what Patrick has said, that reading could be seen as we all know from Roland Barthes, any reading is also a kind of rereading. And so there is the same moment of repetition and iteration here that may be doing something to us as human beings that is enormously helpful. That's just an idea. I may be wrong, but
no, I think this puts or poses a question that we tend not to look at anymore in our work, or it has become old-fashioned or something. To look at really what reading does, what it does with what the function of reading is. What's the function of the fact that still in this digital age, we still read books all the time. All kinds of people read books all the time. What does that do? It does something. But our accounts of that, and Klaus, you've dealt with that a lot. You've thought about these questions a lot. Our accounts of that are somewhat, or tend to be very Manichaean. They tend to be very dichotomous. Either it's it's going to save us, or it's just a waste of time, or it's nothing, or yeah, but really, how does reading work is somehow very unfashionable to explore and very unexplored.
Right.
Yeah.
Hi, my name is Maria, and thanks very much for this very rich and invigorating discussion and the talk. And I mean, as we were talking about the representations of death and especially confrontation, sorry for bringing it up again, but I can't help looking back into Don DeLillo's canon here and bring up that Cosmopolis as a possible, as some sort of a work to be juxtaposed with Zero K. And I wondered if you yourself find something in it as well, in terms of the pursuit of death. I mean, it has. There are, of course, connections with grief and collective grief, as it has been treated as 9/11 literature, etc. But I believe that there is that this lens that you're presenting today is very fruitful for this one, especially considering that the language is in the whole novel is very pregnant and woven with different meanings, so one can really read into it, and the whole pursuit and confrontation with the absolute other at the end of the novel, and the final capturing of time in the watch, where the whole cycling and recycling and frozenness of temporality happens. So I mean, many of the notions and topics that were mentioned here are kind of just rang into parts of that novel, and I wondered if there is a way to tie it, or perhaps to even speak of a continuous thread of topics in his canon or in his oeuvre, or I mean, some psychoanalytic readings have been posed of that being like a death drive, and well, perhaps a more literal drive than only a psychoanalytic one, like the limo through New York. But then also, I believe there is also a scene of his own personal grief as a death procession goes through New York, of this big rap icon that passes away, and it is also very culturally very charged with meaning. So just like I've thrown out a ton of it. So I just wanted to see if it might resonate with anything for you. Thanks.
Well, hearing you talk about it, it tells me that there's something there, but I haven't read Cosmopolis under this lens, and it's been a while since I read it, and I'd have to reread it. And your comments remind me that possibly my choice of books is too restricted for the kind of argument that I'm trying to make, or that the argument that I'm trying to make would allow a much more diverse selection of texts than the ones that I have chosen so far, simply in thematic terms. Yeah. And I would have to reread Cosmopolis again in order to pursue this idea how this also is a book that narrates an encounter with mortality. Yeah. Sorry that I can't say, but I think you're more eloquent about this than I can be.
That's perfectly fine. But I'm grateful for anything taken into consideration.
I would actually have a question of myself also. So if I remember correctly, you mentioned in Zero K that this agency that is, taking care of this freezing process kind of only encourages rich people to extend their life and sort of defy death. And I was wondering if the novel itself sort of comments on that classism, or generally comments on this question that it sort of brings up of like who is valuable of an extension of life, or whose death is taken as a granted, or who is able to meet death, or as you say, encounter death in certain ways, and how might this differ for different people and how they are viewed within society.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Clearly the novel totally exhibits the fact that this is an option very rich people may choose, the option to buy themselves out of death. But the interesting thing about the novel is that this buying themselves out of death is presented as a buying oneself out of life. And it's not presented as something that is worth achieving at all. It's presented by this company as special and as life extension, and it's presented in this, in this advertising language as sort of the best to be achieved. But the novel itself, with very sparse means, presents this presentation as very questionable, not only because it caters to the very rich, but because of what it does. And it's also presented as, I tried to clarify that as sort of an extreme mirror for late capitalist ideas of progress. Okay. And clearly, with the story of the narrator's partner and her son Stack, who's going back to Ukraine and is involved in some war or terrorist activity there and dies there violently, is very much a counter image to what's going on in the compound, both in economic terms and in terms of how life and death are addressed. And so I think this economic inequality is very much exhibited here as dismantling itself, or as the not the inequality doesn't dismantle itself, but the exposition of the very rich dismantle economic advantage. That's maybe a better way to put it.
I want to express my gratitude to, first of all of you who joined in, and in particularly to Antje for this presentation of a truly fascinating project, and I really mean that. And the fact that, it was relatively easy to come up with questions and comments, and everybody, could think of something, speaks to the urgency, I think, of this topic, particularly for, literary scholars. So I want to thank you, and I want to also, say that we should maybe at some point continue this conversation, and you have an open invitation to come back at any time and tell us about what kind of progress you made, and whether or not you are going into new and exciting directions with this project. And so I want to thank you truly for doing this. Usually, we are at least 3 times as many people as have showed up tonight, but this is the final week of classes, and people
don't apologize. You were a great crowd.
Okay, yeah. So I want to thank all of you for that as well, and have a great summer, and be safe. And we look forward to maybe a semester where we can talk to each other face to face, and then we'll definitely continue that conversation.